And the train has just arrived. This one goes from Tashkent to Urgench and to Hiva. And Hiva, yes, is going to be my second stop in Uzbekistan. There we go. Check it out. Jingwu is the only one. And the other good news is, this time I got a lower bunk. That is Turkmenistan. Hiva. Hello viewers, welcome to Hiva, one of the oldest oases in Central Asia and the brightest star in Western Uzbekistan. When you get here, it is difficult not to be impressed by its mesmerizing blue tiles, huge minarets, mausoleums, palaces, and mosques. Honestly, walking in here after 14 plus hours on a night train feels a bit like time travel. The city's glory is absolutely soaked in every piece of tile and brick. But if you are a student of history, you should know that behind every glory there is a story. And unfortunately, not all the stories are bright and hopeful. There are some rather dark and disturbing stories, such as the story of Hiva. And while we're here, let's talk about the darker side of Hiva. Once the most notorious center of slave trade on Earth. So in the 16th century, when the function of the Silk Road had largely been replaced by the Sea Road, a group of Uzbeks founded a state here called Brezm, aka the Khanate of Hiva, and the capital city was Hiva. By then, the Silk Road had shortened significantly, but it was still active among the locals and was famous for trading something other than silk: slaves. Come to think of it, from the 16th century to the 19th century, the Silk Road should really be called the Slave Road, because for over 300 years, they were the main commodities. Not just Hiva, Bukhara, Samarkand, Karakorum, Kars, and Charju all had massive slave bazaars all the way to the late 19th century. Due to their locations bordering two massive deserts, Karakorum and Kazakh, they became convenient trading posts for nomadic tribes such as the Turkmen, Kazakhs, and Kyrgyz, who abducted people from surrounding regions. Countless unlucky merchants, travelers, villagers, and pilgrims were captured, deprived of their freedom, and sold right here in this plaza. This plaza near the East Gate was where the slave market was held. And you see all these niches on the passage walls. They once held slaves. And there were niches like that on either side of this passage walls. There's a dozen of them, yeah. But back then, this was where a lot of trade happened. Just imagine their lives. Yesterday, they were someone else's fathers, sons, wives, and daughters. And they were visiting a family friend. And all of a sudden, some horsemen showed up, took everything they had, and marched them across either the Karakum or the Kizokum to here, to become someone else's slave. I don't know about you, I'd kill myself right then and there, not even joking. This is just outrageous and heartbreaking. At its height, about 100,000 slaves were sold in Hiva and Bukhara every year. As a matter of fact, most of the Hiva we see today were built by those unfortunate slaves. The raiders performed regular slave raids alongside the borders of Persia and Russia toward two sources of slaves: Russian settlers along the Ural and Persian pilgrims to Mashhad. You might be wondering now, okay, I understand the Russians were targeted for being Christians, but why the Persians? They were Islamic people too. Islam banned Muslims from enslaving other Muslims. So how did they pull that one off? You see, the Persians were and still are mostly Shia Muslims, while Hiva and Bukhara were and still are Sunni Muslims. To the Sunni Muslims, especially to those raiders, the Shia Muslims were no Muslims at all. They were just walking cash. So the raiders back then were like, okay folks, let's hunt them down and treat them for money. During the first half of the 19th century, about 1 million Persians were enslaved and transported to Central Asian khanates. In the 19th century, the Turkmen became so well known for their slave trade that it was said that Turkmen would not hesitate to sell into slavery to profit himself if they fall into their hands. The Russians, however, had a slightly different story. As the Russians expanded their empire, bordering more and more nomadic peoples, the Russian frontier cities quickly became the victims of Kazakh and Kyrgyz raids. In 1717, 3,000 Russians were sold in Hiva. In 1722, there were over 5,000 Russian slaves in Bukhara. In the period between 1764 and 1803, 20 Russian caravans were plundered. In 1830, the Russian government estimated that about 200 Russians were enslaved and sold here in Hiva every year. Countless Persians and Russian slaves came into the city on roads like this. You can see the marks. And off they go to their buyers, their new owners, new masters. If you are wondering what would happen to the enslaved young girls, well, this is your answer. This was the harem where both the legal wives and slave concubines lived. You see, the Khans normally had 4 Muslim free women as wives. But, a man's desire knows no limits. There shall be more. So, in addition, the Khans would buy slave girls from the slave market, which is quite handy, just around the corner. And after the basic trainings, these girls, some of them will be selected to become Khans, concubines, and some of them were not so lucky. They will be sold back to the market. The notorious slave trade also targeted the Turkmens themselves. In 1704, a band of slavers raided a Turkmen village in Khorasan, killing many peasants and enslaving many more. Among the captives was a teenage boy who grew up to be one of the most feared men in history. 36 years later, he would conquer Khiva, behead the Khivan Khan, and freed tens of thousands of slaves. To the slaves of Khiva, he was a liberator, the chosen one, the long-awaited savior. But to the wider region, the Caucasus, the Middle East, South Asia, and Central Asia, he was a nightmare, a monster, a devil. His name was Nader Shah. By the early 18th century, the 2-century-old Safavid Empire was crumbling. Surrounded by enemies, Ottomans, Uzbeks, Mughals, and the expanding Russians in Dagestan, it seemed doomed. Yet, it was not these powerful adversaries that delivered the fatal strike, but the seemingly less significant mountain tribes on its eastern border, the Afghans. Nobody really knows the origin story of the Afghans. Like the Tajiks, they are Eastern Iranians and speak a variation of Persian. But unlike their urbanized cousins, the Afghans live in tribes. As a matter of fact, they are still the largest tribal society in the world, with over 60 million people and between 350 and 400 tribes and clans. As for how and when they end up in those mountains and how their tribal society formed, it is still a mystery. Like the Tajiks, the Afghans hadn't really set up their own regime before the 18th century. They stayed as independent tribes overseen by bigger empires. Sometimes the Iranians ruled them, sometimes the Mughals ruled them, sometimes the Uzbeks ruled them. And most of the time, the region was split into 3 parts: Kabul under Mughal control, Khorasan under the Iranians, and Balkh under the Uzbeks. In the late 17th century, many Afghan tribes, especially in the Kandahar region, were under Iranian control. The biggest tribe there was the Gildas, and the most prominent clan of the Gildas was the Hotaks. For a long time, they showed a preference for Iranian rule over the Mughals. The Iranians left them alone and even cut their taxes. But towards the end of the century, the new Shah of Iran came along and departed from the tolerant policy, turning the Kandahar region into a military occupation. Well, needless to say, this didn't sit well with the locals. The Gilda Afghan chieftain Mirwais Hotak called a jihad on Iran and wiped out the Kandahar governor and his troops. The Shah tried at least 3 times to crush the rebellion, but each attempt failed. By the time Mirwais Hotak died in 1715, he had already brought some independence to the Afghans, founded the Hotak dynasty, and caused severe damage to Iran. However, his son Mahmud Hotak had even bigger plans. He wanted to take down the entire Safavid Empire. In 1720, he extended his territory to Turkmen. 2 years later, he defeated the Shah's army, eventually capturing the Iranian capital, Isfahan. The Shah abdicated and recognized Mahmud Hotak as the new Shah of Iran in 1722. For the first time ever, these Sunni tribal Afghans in the mountains had conquered the urban Shia cousins. The Hotaks' rule over Iran didn't last long though, partly because Mahmud Hotak died in 1725 at a very young age, and partly because his successor, Ashraf, pissed off a lot of key figures in Iran, including a Turkmen general named Nader. The Turkmens were a people of considerable military importance in history, playing key roles in the rise of several empires stretching from modern-day Turkey to Pakistan. One of the most formidable Turkmen militant groups was the Kizilbashi. They were instrumental in founding the Safavid Empire in 1501 and were directly responsible for the Shianization of Iran. It was within this group that Nader was born late in the 17th century. Nader had a very humble start. His father died when he was young, and by the time he was a teenager, he and his mom were taken into slavery. But his military talent didn't take long to get noticed, and soon he was leading a group of raiders near Mashhad. After the Afghans took down the Safavid Empire, Nader struck a deal with Mahmud Hotak to rule Kalat. But the submission was only nominal, so when the Safavid royals came to him wanting to team up with him and kick out the Afghans together, Nader jumped at the chance and became the commander-in-chief of the Iranian army.
He then quickly captured Mashhad and subjugated Herat by May 1729. By September, Nader recaptured Isfahan and restored the Safavid rule. Afterward, he reclaimed most of the Iranian territories lost to the Russians and Ottomans, becoming a figure of national importance. The Safavid rulers, on the other hand, were becoming less important and were eventually overthrown by the Turkmen general in 1736. Nader then established the Afsharid Iran, becoming a Shah himself. With Iran and its territories secured, Nader Shah turned east. In 1736, he laid siege to Kandahar, crushing the last Gilza Afghan stronghold. Afterward, on the pretext of Mughal refusal to hand over the Afghan fugitives, he invaded the Mughal Empire. Ghazni, Kabul, Peshawar, Lahore, and Delhi were all occupied, looted, and massacred. His son Reza also joined the campaign. In 1737, while Nader was busy with Kandahar, Reza captured Balkh, Kunduz, and Badakhshan. He then headed north into Transoxiana and defeated the Bukharan Khan. Nader, worried about a potential alliance between the Uzbeks of Khiva and Bukhara, ordered his son to pull back. Now, with Nader and Reza both gone, the Khivan Khan saw an opportunity and plundered Khorasan. This infuriated the Turkmen Shah. When he returned from India, he went straight to Transoxiana, subdued Bukhara in the summer of 1740, and set out to punish Khiva. The Khivan Khan was defeated and killed that autumn. There, Nader freed tens of thousands of slaves. 7 years later, on the night of June 20, 1747, the Turkmen Shah was stabbed to death by 15 assassins. Before he died, the Shah fought back fiercely and killed 2 of his assassins in the darkness. After his death, his empire fell apart almost instantly. All those wars and oppressive rule had caused widespread misery among his people. The only ones who truly mourned his passing were the slaves he had freed. The power structure of Transoxiana was completely changed because of Nader Shah. The Khanate of Bukhara was devastated, and the Bukharan Khans were wiped out. Without the Chinggisid rulers, the Khanate of Bukhara continued to decline, eventually becoming the Emirate of Bukhara. The Khanate of Khiva, on the other hand, quickly regained its strength, revived the slave trade, and prospered. Khiva itself saw a lot of construction and became one of the most beautiful cities in the world. The Khanate of Kokand, though, completely escaped the attention of Nader Shah and saw a large-scale migration, which gradually became a densely populated center of agricultural life. But Transoxiana wasn't the only place Nader reshaped. He also had a huge impact on the Afghans and played a key role in the establishment of the first ever Afghan state, the Durrani Empire. Previously, we covered how the Gilza Afghans rose to prominence and established the Hotak dynasty and how they were overthrown by Nader Shah. But Gilzas were not the only Afghan tribe to rise to prominence. Another rival tribe from the Kandahar and Herat region, the Abdalis, also rose to prominence, and the two tribes were enemies. In 1729, after Nader overthrew the Gilza Afghans in Isfahan, he led his army to Herat, the stronghold of the Abdali Afghans. The Abdalis put up a hopeless fight before surrendering. Many joined Nader's army, while others fled to Kandahar, the Gilzas' base, and were taken hostages by the rebels. Among the hostages was a 7-year-old boy, Ahmad Abdali, the son of the Abdali ruler of Herat. Ahmad spent his childhood as a hostage in Kandahar, and when he turned 14 years old, Nader Shah returned. This time, Nader was determined to crush the last Gilza stronghold, Kandahar, and use it as a springboard for his invasion of the Mughal Empire. The siege went on for 15 months, and Kandahar finally surrendered in March 1738. Afterward, Nader enlisted many Afghan fighters into his army and freed all the Abdalis held captive by the Gilzas, including the 16-year-old Ahmad. Ahmad also joined Nader's army and quickly made a name for himself, rising to command Nader's most elite forces. When Nader was killed in 1747, the Afghan soldiers in his army held together and returned to their homeland. As they marched towards Kandahar, the surrounding Afghan chieftains chose Ahmad Abdali to lead them. By July 1747, Ahmad was crowned at Kandahar. He was only 25 years old. Ahmad then took the title Duri Duran, Pearl of Pearls, renamed after the tribe to Durrani, and established the Durrani Empire, the first ever Afghan empire. The king had a very successful career, and it was largely due to two key factors: his military talent and perfect timing. On one side, India was in chaos after the disintegration of the Mughal Empire, and on the other, Iran was crippled by the infighting following the death of Nader Shah. The young king began his rise by bringing all Afghan districts into one political unit. In 1747, he took control of Ghazni and Kabul, both of which were still under Mughal rule. With the possession of Kandahar and Kabul, the two gates of Hindustan, the Afghan king headed south, occupied Peshawar, and crossed the Indus River. By the end of 1748, he had taken all territories west of the Indus from the Mughals. The king then pushed Afghan dominion further, taking Khorasan and recapturing his homeland, Herat, in 1750. He then marched on from Herat and seized Mashhad. In 1751, Ahmad Shah captured Nishapur and signed a treaty with the Iranians, receiving all the border towns around Herat and Sistan. On his way home, he sent an expedition north and captured Balkh, Kanabad, Maimana, and Badakhshan. A year later, Kashmir, Lahore, and Multan were also added to his empire. Despite the ongoing unrest in Punjab, Ahmad Shah kept the region under control until 1758, when the rising Maratha Empire entered the picture. Punjab quickly became the battleground between these two new powers, and in 1761, the Afghans decisively crushed the Maratha army. After this victory, Ahmad Shah was at the peak of his power and built a new capital in Kandahar. Indian and Persian engineers were brought in to design and construct buildings and fortifications. All Afghan tribes were invited to build their own houses in the new capital. However, by the late 1760s, his territories in Khorasan and Punjab became increasingly unstable. Although the revolt in Khorasan was put down, Punjab was practically lost. Shortly after, on October 23, 1772, the first Afghan king passed away. Before Ahmad Shah's rise to power, the land we now call Afghanistan was either controlled by outside powers or, when those powers put back, became a tangled mass of warring tribal chieftains. Ahmad Shah was the first to successfully unite Afghan tribes and other peoples of the land into a single state. Out of tribes, this guy forged a nation. Under his leadership, Afghanistan enjoyed long-lasting peace, and both its economy and culture flourished. By the time of his death, the Durrani Empire had become a major power in South Asia, wielding immense influence over both India and Iran. Meanwhile, far to the north, the once unchallenged nomads had lost their supremacy for good, never to rise again.
Hello viewers, welcome to Chengde Mountain Resort, the summer palace of the Qing Empire and the largest existing imperial garden in China. You see, the Manchus were from Manchuria, a much cooler place than North China Plain. So when they conquered China, the Manchu emperors preferred not to spend the hot summers in Beijing and wanted to find somewhere more spacious with forests, plains, and springs. Besides, the Manchus at that time had just started their alliance with the Ottoman Mongols and needed to consolidate that alliance. However, the smallpox ravaged China at the time, and the Mongol princes feared the deadly disease and rarely came to Beijing. So to consolidate that alliance with the Inner Mongols and Outer Mongols, Kangxi decided to go beyond the Great Wall and meet them instead. Because there were so many imperial carriages and horses, they could only travel a maximum of 20 kilometers per day. And since the population along this route was very sparse, a small palace was built every 20 kilometers, and a larger palace was built every 40 kilometers. But clearly, this was not a sustainable solution. The destination was too far, and the journey was too dangerous. Kangxi needed a better solution so that he could meet the Mongols somewhere in the middle. And in 1701, he found the perfect solution. In that year, while on a trip to Mulan hunting ground, Kangxi came across an area with magnificent scenery and no previous human habitation. He then made the decision to build a new palace there, which later became the Chengde Mountain Resort. Well, after the completion of the Chengde Mountain Resort, this place had become the second political center outside of Beijing. Many state affairs, including military matters, relations with the Tibetans and Mongols, and foreign policy, were handled here in this mountain resort instead of the Forbidden City in Beijing. It served as a backdrop for many pivotal historical events during the Qing Empire. And of course, that includes the conquest of the Jingwu.
After the death of the Jingwu Khan Sewaraptan in 1727, his son Captain Talon took over. Under Talon's rule, the Jingwu Khan ensured stability despite occasional conflicts with neighboring peoples. In the late 1720s, the Kazakhs managed to defeat the Jingwu briefly, but their victory didn't last long. In response to the ongoing Jingwu threat, the junior and middle horse accepted Russian suzerainty in the 1730s, marking the beginning of Russia's influence over the Kazakhs. On the other hand, the Qing-Jingwu rivalry continued throughout the 1720s, 30s, and 40s, but there were only two major battles, both fought in Mongolia. The Jingwu won the one near Hoft, while the Qing won the one near Heraklion. For the Qing Empire, the Jingwu were a big pain in the butt. To deal with them, the Qing spent decades building military routes to extend their influence into the eastern Tarim Basin. On top of that, the Qing further alienated the Jingwu by forming a strong alliance with the Mongols and banning their religious missions to Tibet. After securing the border and trade deals with the Qing Empire in 1727, even the Russians lost interest in backing the Jingwu. Isolated, the Jingwu pushed west again, launching a new wave of invasions across the Kazakh steppe. From 1739 to 1741, they struck in every direction, crushing the Kazakh army. Many Kazakh leaders were captured and held for ransom. Among them was the Khan of the Middle Horde, Ablai. This, however, turned out to be the Jingwu's final raid on the Kazakhs. 4 years later, in 1745, the 52-year-old Jingwu Khan Captain Talon died, and within 5 years, civil war ripped the Khanate apart. In 1748, the Kazakh Khan Ablai took advantage of this chaos and recaptured some lost territories in Transoxiana. But the final blow that wiped out the Jingwu people and their legacy came from the east.
You see, what really makes Chengde Mountain Resort stand out from the Forbidden City in Beijing are these Tibetan temples right next to it. I mean, after all, to some degree, the Qing Empire was a theocracy, and the sponsorship of the Yellow School Tibetan Buddhism was very, very important for the Manchu emperors. There are dozens of these Tibetan temples, and I'm gonna show you 3 of them. And the first one is this beautiful hut. Putuo Zongcheng Temple was built between 1767 and 1771. It was modeled after the Potala Palace of Lhasa, the residence of the Dalai Lama built over a century earlier. The locals simply called it the Little Potala Palace, and it was dedicated to celebrate Qianlong's 60th birthday and his mom's 80th birthday. During the Qing dynasty, a lot of Mongol princes and Tibetan lamas came here to offer incense. And east of Pudozongcheng Temple is the Xunmifusho Temple. So in 1778, Emperor Qianlong invited the 6th Panchen Lama to come to Beijing to celebrate his 70th birthday. And to mark this occasion, Emperor Qianlong ordered the construction of Xunmifusho Temple. The temple was modeled after the Tashilumpo Monastery of Shikaze, the residence of Panchen Lama. The locals simply call it the Little Tashilumpo. The 6th Panchen Lama arrived in Chengde in the summer of 1780, and this hall right there, Jixiang Xifa Hall, was where the 6th Panchen Lama lived. And here we are at the temple with the most dramatic history, the Puning Temple. This one was built decades earlier than the Pudozongcheng Temple and the Xunmifusho Temple. It was built in 1755 and was finished in 1759. It was not only built for, but during the conquest of the Zhengges. Over the course of its construction, Qianlong conquered and destroyed the Zhengges as a people. You see, at the beginning of the Zhengge Civil War, when all the factions were fighting each other, many Zhengge princes and leaders found refuge in Qing. They submitted to Qianlong and came here, the mountain resort. Here they received lavish welcome, princely titles, and banquets after banquets. Many of them spent months here just partying, hunting, drinking, visiting lamas with Emperor Qianlong. But nothing comes without a price. All of these Zhengge princes, refugees, or generals were settled in the Qing territory under close control. Among them was Amursana. He was among the last to come and first to leave.
As more and more defeated Zhengge leaders went to Qing for support, Emperor Qianlong decided to step in and back one of the contenders, Amursana. He was on good terms with both the Manchus and the Kazakhs and had even married Ablai Khan's daughter. In March 1755, Qianlong sent two armies of 25,000 men each against the Zhengges. One set out from Oliaste and the other from Barkor. The Zhengges, still divided among themselves, surrendered with little resistance.
After the Qing army conquered the Zhengges, took Kucha, and captured the Zhengge Khan Davachi, Qianlong conferred titles of the nobles of the 4 old tribes at the mountain resort. And since the Zhengge Mongols were also followers of the Yellow School Tibetan Buddhism, Qianlong ordered the construction of this temple, which was modeled after the Samya Monastery in Tibet. He named it Puning Temple, which literally means universal peace in Chinese. But the thing that I really want to show you are these articles on the stone steels. Let's put it this way, they are quite spicy. The article in the center commemorated the founding of this temple, while the other two were on a very unique subject: how Qianlong conquered and destroyed the Zhengges. As usual, they were all written in 4 languages: Manchurian, Mongolian, Chinese, and Tibetan. The words Qianlong used in these 2 articles were so strong, so dehumanizing, and so hateful that to this very day you cannot find full copies or transcriptions of these two articles on any Chinese website. The only copies I found online were done by a German scholar in the 1950s. This is that article over there, and this is that article right over there. I read this thoroughly, and since then I have always wanted to be here and read these two articles with my own eyes. Now that I'm here, let's read it.
Let's first take a look at the article on the left, written right after the Zhonga conquest in 1755. 自如准噶尔业异蒙古同类何自外泄，术士耿化篡夺相仍硕筹其下，觉达瓦齐慎独于醒，众心底底，如苗丝毛，如毁丝事，众口嗷嗷。是尔敖止，子交老止，期就不重招止。是尔嫡止，子依稀止，其出汝图拟止。乃命心腹耳为先锋，熟悉其路。乃命禁旅携数月两亩，或略鲁。乌鲁木齐及武及塞渡之折折，台基宰桑，迎降恐后，西市府坑。波罗塔拉塔尔齐岭，险如关河。倒戈反攻达瓦齐，走弹西途穷。自今已始，四部我臣，伊犁我与业。曰绰罗斯及杜尔伯特和硕特辉特，封四可汗，众建王公，游牧各安。醉饮饱食，静心皇教，福自天赐。伊犁平业矣，乐真民业矣，余万斯年矣。Qianlong's original plan was to turn the former Zhonga Khanate into two vassal states, one in the Zhongarian Basin and another in the Tarim Basin. The northern one was to be given to Amursana, while the southern one was to be given to Apak Hoja's two great-grandsons, Burhanuddin Hoja and Jahan Hoja. However, this plan failed miserably, as neither Amursana nor the Apaki brothers were okay to be a Qing vassal, and both revolted. Amursana quickly retook Kurja and Urumqi, wiping out the Qing forces. That was the last straw for Qianlong, who ordered a full-scale invasion of Zhongaria to solve the problem once and for all. He offered rewards to Mongols who aided the pursuit and insisted that Ablai Khan capture Amursana if he fled to the Kazakhs. Over the next 2 years, a series of battles destroyed the Zhongas as a people. Young men were slaughtered on the spot when captured, and even children and women were not spared. They were either killed or enslaved. A few managed to escape to the Kazakhs, where they suffered the same fate, while the rest died of smallpox. The generals who carried out the massacres were promoted and praised, while those who let the Zhongas escape were demoted and punished. Following the extermination, the Zhongarian Basin was completely depopulated and annexed into the Qing Empire. Many elite Kyrgyz soldiers who fought for the Zhongas were also driven away. Most of them fled southeast and joined the Kokandi army. Others returned north to the Yenisei River, while those captured by Qing forces were relocated as far as Manchuria. Even today, you can still find about 10 Kyrgyz speakers in Fuyu County. After the Zhonga genocide, Qianlong wrote the article on the right in 1758, justifying the massacre. 天之所培者，人虽亲之不可及也；天之所负者，人虽在之不可止也。皆如准噶尔何居诈相言以示而为贼也。强食若众，凌寡血人于牙，而灭之权益也云。兴黄教敬佛菩萨，其心乃如夜叉罗刹之，以人为食也。故罪深恶极，自作之孽，难换活也。终于沦亡虚尽，依离言貌万里，既如无人之欲也。是非我加兵不及，以杀为德也。以其反复无常，持亦久而害亦深，则其叛乱之速，未尝非因祸而致福也。是盖天佑我皇卿，究非人力也。
So basically, Qianlong was saying, good riddance. You guys did this to yourself. None of this would have happened if you had kneeled earlier. So now I am eradicating all of you guys for your own good. Well, I mean, that is definitely one way of justifying the killing of all these innocent children and women. I mean, this conquest of the Zhongas started as an invasion, pacification my ass. It was a flat-out invasion from the very beginning. And now you are accusing the people you invaded and killed for betraying you. Are you out of your mind? Besides, you won the battle not because you are morally or even militarily superior to the Zhongas. You won the battle because your father and grandfather paved the road for you. They built the fortresses, they built the supply lines. And most importantly, it was because there was a civil war in the Zhonga Khanate. But like it or not, this is how history works. The winner wins everything, and the loser loses everything. After the victory, the winner can rewrite their past however they want, justify their conquest, justify everything. And the losers, their history will be tarnished, will be changed, will be forgotten, and discarded forever.
Amersana fled to his father-in-law Ablai Khan, who sheltered him briefly in the summer of 1756. But once Ablai realized Amersana had little hope of victory, he turned his back on him and let him go. This angered Emperor Qianlong, which led to the breakdown of the alliance between the Kazakhs and the Manchus. In 1757, Qing forces invaded the Kazakh Middle Horde, and Ablai Khan surrendered. As a result, the southeastern region of Lake Balkhash was ceded to the Qing Empire. Amersana fled to the Russians in Semipalatinsk and was later taken to Tobolsk, where he died of smallpox on September 21, 1757, at the age of 35. With his death, the legend of the last Steppe Empire was over, closing a long and dramatic chapter in history. The Qing's westward expansion might have stopped at this point, but circumstances kept pushing them forward. A new set of campaigns brought Qing forces further west than any China-based armies had gone in 1,000 years. Let's not forget that the Zhongas were not the only ones who rose up against the Qing Empire. Apak Hoja's great-grandsons, Burhanuddin Hoja and Jahan Hoja, also rebelled in the Tarim Basin. These Hojas had never been loyal to the Zhongas in the first place, and the rivalry between the Black and White Mountain Hojas never died out. So even after the Zhongas were exterminated, Qing's control over the Tarim Basin wasn't guaranteed at all. The Manchus had to rely on the Hojas to govern the region. The brothers, however, saw this as their opportunity to claim the independence they had long been waiting for. So when Amersana revolted in the Zhongaran Basin, the Apaki brothers in the Tarim Basin also revolted. After dealing with the Zhongas in 1757, Qianlong sent another expedition. Over the next 2 years, the Qing armies chased the Hoja brothers and their followers all the way to Transoxiana, where they camped on the outskirts of Tashkent. One unit even made it to Talas, where the Chinese and Arab forces clashed over 1,000 years ago. The brothers eventually took refuge with the ruler of Badakhshan. But as Qing armies arrived in hot pursuit, the ruler of Badakhshan was worried about his own safety and sought aid from the Afghan king Ahmad Shah. But Ahmad was in Delhi at the time and couldn't send any help. Ultimately, Badakhshan gave in, had the Hoja brothers killed, and submitted to the Qing Empire. By the way, this is the skull of the younger brother, Jahan Hoja. Qianlong turned it into a Tibetan Kapala skull cup. If you ever visit Taipei, you should be able to find it in the National Palace Museum. By the time the campaign was called off, several Kazakh and Kyrgyz tribes and numerous rulers had offered their submission, including the Kokandi Khan of the Fergana Valley. While the Qing didn't occupy these lands, and the submission was largely symbolic, the Zhongaran Basin and the Tarim Basin were now firmly tied to the empire. In 1759, with both vessels fully subdued and annexed, Emperor Qianlong combined them and named this vast area Xiyu Xinjiang, Western Region, New Territory, which was later shortened to just Xinjiang, New Territory. The Qing conquest in the West had a massive impact on the region, changing the fate of many states in the years that followed, especially the fate of the Khanate of Kokand.
Alright, a lost city in Uzbekistan. Kokand. This is my hotel room. No, hostel room in Kokand. This is my bed. It's only $5.5 for one night. There's a learning center behind me. It's called Freedom. English Language Learning Center called Freedom. And this is the textbook they're using.
That's
Really interesting.
This name New York. New York, yes.
Pre-intermediate
New York
workbook.
Yes.
And they are only 16 years old and they speak so well. Assalamualaikum. Salam. Assalamualaikum. All right. До свидания.
До свидания.
До свидания. Oops. До свидания, красивее.
До свидания.
Красивее, Kokand. До свидания. Бага-бага. Бага-бага. Crazy kids. Hello viewers, this is Kokand, a city that sits on the southwestern edge of the Fergana Valley. Before the Russians came, this city was the capital city of the Khanate of Kokand, and that building behind me was the Khan's palace. Like the Khanate of Khiva and Khanate of Bukhara, the Khanate of Kokand was quite special in several ways. First of all, the Fergana Valley was completely within its control. Not like today, shared by 3 different countries, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. Back then, it was all part of the Khanate of Kokand. Secondly, this region was the religious center of Fergana Valley. It was considered as a spiritual mecca. And lastly, among all the Khanates of Central Asia, the Khanate of Kokand had continuously posed a threat to the Qing Empire for at least 120 years until it was annexed by the Russians in 1876. This Khanate and the Fergana Valley had produced waves of military and religious figures that had seriously threatened the Qing Empire's rule of Western China.
The Khanate of Kokand had always been lucky. In the early 1700s, the Khanate of Bukhara experienced a drastic decline, and the Fergana Valley slipped out of its control. Around 1706, an Uzbek emir stepped into the power vacuum and founded the Khanate of Kokand. In the 1720s, the new Khanate faced some disruptions from the Kazakh barefooted flight, but came out okay. In the 1740s, it completely escaped Nader Shah's attention. In the 1750s, the Afghan king Ahmad Shah spared it. Now in the 1760s, it submitted to the Qing Empire. In 1774, Kokand officially became a tributary state. It was allowed to send tribute missions to the Qing Empire, which returned with lavish gifts from the emperor and could bring along merchants exempt from tariffs. The submission also granted the Kokandi merchants the right to trade in Xinjiang at favorable tax rates. Fergana merchants had long traded in the Tarim Basin, but Kokan's relationship with the Qing led to a massive expansion in their activity. Commercial growth and stability paved the way for significant territorial expansion. By the end of the 18th century, the Khanate of Kokand had brought the entire Fergana Valley under its control. Starting in the 19th century, the Kokandi forces went on to conquer Tashkent and Turkestan, forcing the local Kazakh and Kyrgyz tribes into submission. Its territory extended north to Lake Balkhash and west to Siberia, giving it a stronger hold over the steppe than any sedentary state since the time of Timur. On the trade front, the Khanate of Kokand maintained a tributary relationship with the Qing Empire, while also establishing trade relations with Russia. This opened up east-west trade routes, making it the largest trading nation in Central Asia. At the time, the gold and silver ornaments, weapons, and even daily necessities circulating in the Central Asian bazaars were all monopolized by the Kokandi merchants. As the economy grew, Kokand offered patronage to poets, artists, historians, and engineers from across Central and South Asia, and oversaw the construction of many mosques, madrasas, and irrigation canals. Within a few decades, Kokand became the military, religious, and commercial center of the region, attracting immigrants from both Transoxiana and the Tarim Basin. With a booming economy, a modernized army, and territorial gains in the north, south, and west, the Kokandi rulers turned east and started making plans for Kashgar. Kashgar and Fergana Valley go way back and are deeply connected geographically, economically, religiously, and culturally. Remember that Apakoja Mausoleum in Kashgar from the last episode? Guess what the village is in is called? Let's do a quick zoom in on the map. Yep, there we go. Haohan, which is how you say Kokand in Chinese. And remember that Persian poem at the entrance? Well, the builder actually left his own message on the other side. It reads, the tile maker in Kunakani, Master Mir Bak from Namagan, which is one of the largest cities in the Fergana Valley. So it turns out that some of the builders of the Apakoja Mausoleum, the holiest site in Kashgar, were actually from the Fergana Valley. And the strongest tie connecting the two regions was, as you should know by now, the worship of the White Mountain Hojas. So to stir things up in Kashgar without jeopardizing the lucrative trading relations with the Qing Empire, the Kokandi Hans used these Hojas. You see, when the Apaki brothers were killed in Badakhshan in 1759, the Qing officials demanded the return of their bodies and the bodies of Burhanuddin Hoja's 4 sons, as Jahan Hoja had no sons. But they only retrieved 5 bodies because Burhanuddin Hoja's 4th son, Salim Sak, had escaped. Salim Sak eventually turned up in the Fergana Valley and was held hostage by the Kokandi Khan. In 1788, Beijing demanded his extradition, but Kokand refused. Salim Sak then lived out his days in golden captivity in Kokand and had many children, and his children had even more children. By the early 19th century, the Fergana Valley had virtually become a breeding ground for the White Mountain Hojas. And these Hojas never forgot their roots in Kashgar, never gave up their fight against the Qing Empire, and they were about to reshape the future of Kokand and Kashgar. Salim Sak's second son, Jahangir Hoja, was the first to act. In 1814, he left Kokand with a small Kyrgyz force and attacked Kashgar. The Qing army repelled this incursion and he escaped back to Kokand. The Kokandi Khan reprimanded him but took no further action. 6 years later, in 1820, Jahangir tried again and was repelled again. This time, the Kokandi Khan put him under house arrest. 2 years later, Jahangir escaped and launched a third attack in 1826. This time, the people of Kashgar heard about the return of Apakoja's descendant, rose up on his behalf, and slaughtered the Qing troops stationed in Kashgar. By autumn, Jahangir had taken control of Yarkand and Khotan, restoring the Hoja power in the Tarim Basin after 60 years of Qing rule. For Jahangir, this was simply a matter of regaining his rights to restore the lands of his ancestors. But for the Qing authorities, this was the largest rebellion in Xinjiang unseen in decades that demanded the highest level of punishment. The Qing government then sent thousands of troops and retook Kashgar in March 1827. Jahangir was captured a year later, taken to Beijing, questioned, sliced to pieces, and fed to the dogs. Due to his connection with Kokand, the Qing Empire severed the diplomatic relations with the Khanate of Kokand. The Qing then increased troop levels in the Tarim Basin, expelled all Kokandi merchants, and confiscated the property. But this backfired. With little left to lose, the Kokandi Khan Madali arrived in Kashgar personally in 1831 and launched a jihad. Although he couldn't drive out the Qing forces, he turned his retreat into a commercial and diplomatic victory. At this point, Qing authority in Xinjiang had been significantly weakened. To avoid further conflicts, the Qing allowed Kokandi merchants back in and compensated them for the loss of their property during the expulsion. More remarkably, they granted Kokandi merchants the privilege of tax-free trade. So basically, because of this invasion that failed, the Khanate of Kokand had gone from being a protectorate to having extraterritorial privileges in Xinjiang, the same privileges enjoyed only by the European empires. However, Kokand's luck was about to run out. The nobles started fighting each other for power, while the Kazakh and Kyrgyz tribes rebelled frequently. This instability drew the attention of the Bukharan emir, Nasrullah, who had long been wary of Kokand's growth and was waiting for the right moment to strike. In 1839, Madli built a fort near the Bukharan front. Nasrullah was outraged and declared war. The war dragged on for over 2 years until 1841. The Bukharans defeated the Kokandis and captured Oratepa and Kujand. A year later, Nasrullah led an army into the Fergana Valley and occupied the city of Kokand. Madli was captured in Margilan and executed in April 1842. Along with the executed were his children, most members of the Kokandi royal family, and his mom, the famous poet Nodira. Although the Bukharan forces were driven out after only a few weeks, the Khanate of Kokand never recovered from the crisis. Meanwhile, the Russians had made their way through the Kazakh steppe, threatening Kokand's rule. The British, on the other hand, had made their way to the court of Bukhara. And Emir Nasrullah was about to make himself a household name in Victorian England, because merely 2 months after he butchered the Kokandi royal family, he chopped off the heads of not 1, but 2 British officers